Shabbat shalom. It's great to see everyone this morning. I have to tell you, I always dread the beginning of Nisan. Not Nisan, excuse me, Adar. And the reason, I think people think that's strange. Last week when we started Adar, Iris led us in a rousing chorus of, when Adar comes, everybody's happy. And yet I dread it. Does anybody know why? Why do you think I dread Adar? What? Well, Purim's coming. Now, that sounds even odder. Because I really don't, I'm not a great fan of Purim, but really for only one reason. I have a real trouble getting in costumes and figuring out what I can do to wear for Purim. A rabbi, you have to wear a costume. And so I struggle. I think, how can I be creative? I hate themes. Purim it's really, really complicated. So this year I found something that I am going to wear. I'm going to be dressing as a golem, but as a modern take on a golem. So if anybody can guess what I'm going to be dressing as, let me know during the Kiddush later on. So I did come up with something for this year. But I was thinking about that, and you may think, well, why is the rabbi talking about costumes today? Well, I was thinking about costumes, but I was wondering, how do costumes transform people? Do costumes actually make somebody a different person? And there are some societies where people put in costume, and that gives them a sense, or even just a little bit of a mask, and that gives them a freedom to run wild, as if nobody's going to recognize that it's Charlie who's running wild. Think about it. The Green Hornet wears a mask. Robin wears a mask, and nobody knows who they are. So it must work. It seems like the costume does make the man, or the woman, or the person. It seems like it. And I was thinking about that because there also are rituals where when the person puts on the costume, not only do they mask themselves from anybody else, but also they take on a persona which is greater than themselves. So in Japan, there are mask dances where the masked person no longer is themselves, but is invested by the kami, by the divine. And the kachina dances in the pueblos in the southwest of the United States. The dancers no longer are the individuals who are personating the divine, the kachina, but instead it's the kachina themselves that are visiting the community. So the mask actually does transform the person and make them greater than they are. And I was thinking about that because in our Torah portion today, we have a whole description of a costume. And I found a nice cheat sheet of it. You probably can't see it from that distance, but it's a picture of the high priest with all of his various vestments, which is what we read about today. He had this beautiful mitre. He had what's called the tzitz, a headband which said the divine name on it. He had a breastplate with 12 stones. He had an elaborate garment, an ephod, a sort of a robe. All these elaborate garments. And I was thinking about it because I've always marveled at this. What was the purpose of these garments? And actually, we do wear them today, though everybody gets to share them. And we place some of them on the Torah. But what are the purposes of special garments? Why do priests in other religions wear special garments that set them aside from everybody else? What is it about? Is it the garment that transforms the person almost? Is it the garment that says something about them? Or is it the person themselves? And I wondered about that. I was thinking about that because I was thinking, does the crown make a king? We all saw many of us may have seen the coronation of Charles just a few months ago. And was he really transformed as holy oil was put on his head? He got a crown, now he's the king. But if he went around just as Charles, is he still the king? And I was thinking about that, but everybody remembers the story of the emperor's new clothes, don't you? Do the clothes make the emperor? Or the lack of clothes make the emperor? And is he still emperor when he goes around stark naked through the city? Or do people really see that he's no different than anybody else, that he's just a person, and his arrogance might lend him the idea that he's somebody special, but he's just a human being? I think that's the real message of the emperor's new clothing, to remind us that we're really all the same, whether you wear the crown or not. The pulper can pretend to be the prince, and no one can tell the difference, because indeed, really, we're all pulpers, and maybe we're all princes as well. So I was thinking about that because I was wondering, what does it mean? Why do we wear these elaborate garb? And the tzitz, the headband that the high priest wears, really has a powerful symbolism about what it means and what it means to be a human being and what makes us a human being. The tzitz has God's name on it, and the rabbis say the reason why the tzitz has God's name on it is because the head is the source or the resting place in the human being of the soul. That's where we find God's presence in us. That's where we find the essence of what makes us human. And that really is very important because every one of us shares a soul. Every one of us is created, B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God, and therefore that's something that makes us equal and makes us all part of a human community created in the image of God. A human community that actually contains the essence of God within us. And that's something that the mystics discover within this idea of the tzitz. So I was thinking, well, let's think about this idea of the forehead and what it means for us, and the soul and what it means for us. Now, I'm going to not go into a whole discussion about whether the soul exists or not, or what it is. We can have an adult education class and spend weeks on that. But I do want to think about what it means. And I think that's probably the answer. So what does it mean? Well, Isaac Luria, jumping a few thousand years after the rabbis were talking about the forehead being the seat of the soul, Luria, who was one of the great Kabbalists of Sfat, thought about this idea of that forehead being the seat of the soul, and he was known as a doctor of souls. So he could look at somebody's forehead, see the divine name, and he could see whether there were any problems with it or not. Does anybody know that there are people in Brooklyn that check mezuzot? They will go, not only probably in Brooklyn, but everywhere where there are ultra-Orthodox communities, someone will go, and if you have a problem at home, or if you're sick, or if there's anything wrong, well, there's a problem in your mezuzah. There's a letter that's partially wrong. So Isaac Luria, looking at that metaphorical tzitz that we all have on, we all have the name of God, that soul in our forehead, that headband that we're wearing, he could see it, and he could see, well, that yud has a little bit of a problem with it. That aleph has something wrong with it. It's not quite correct. And then he could say, that's what's wrong with you, that you have a problem in your soul, and if you work, you can fix that problem, and then your soul, your forehead seats, your metaphorical seats, will be corrected, and you will be at one with God. So he was seeing us, and seeing our souls, and seeing something about the name of God, about God's presence in each of us, and how we need to remember that we're at one with God when our souls are connected with God, when we're working in that direction and not working against it. When we work against it, then the mistakes occur. Well, in Hasidic Kabbalah, they picked up from this idea of the soul as a connection with God seated in our forehead, and Hasidic Kabbalah took an idea that was found from 1,000 years before in the Zohar, an idea that God has these things called the 10 Sfirot, 10 knowable aspects of God that come closer and closer to us and allow us to connect with God. But in Kabbalah, there are just those 10 sefirot. Maybe there, and some more complicated versions say there are actually 4 sets of 10 sefirot in all of the spiritual worlds. But in Hasidic Kabbalah, they said the 10 sefirot, this aspect of the truth of God, doesn't only exist in supernal realms or in the material realms as we get closer, but actually the 10 sefirot are the essence of the soul that exists in every single human person. So that's what makes us in the divine image, is that we have God within us. And Laurie was saying we have to enhance and connect with that God in order to be whole. And the Hasidic Kabbalah is agreeing and saying our lives are a whole process of realizing that God is here and we did not know it. Just as God is everywhere and in everything, and though we didn't know it. Now, Buber and Levinas, 2 modern philosophers, thought a lot about Hasidut and thought a lot about the soul and what it means to connect one human being with another. For us to look at somebody else's forehead, just like Loria did, and find a connection. Loria found God, and in a sense, Buber found human beings, and in finding human beings, they also found God. But they actually spoke in almost opposite language. So Levinas is very interested in alterity. He's very interested in difference. And perhaps it's not surprising, because Levinas was writing soon after the Holocaust in most of his work. So Levinas was worried about and thinking about, what does it mean to be different? What does it mean to be the other? And he suggests that when we look at other people, what we really need to be seeing is the other, which also is God. We need to realize that we're all created in the image of God, and yet all of us are different. In a sense, he's picking up an age-old midrash, which captures the idea that as God mints coins, each coin still is in the image of, each human being is still in the image of God, but each one is different. Whereas when a king mints coins, physical coins, they're all identical. So God is expressed through difference, not through sameness. And Levinas is telling us, don't fear the difference, but instead embrace it and realize that that's how we find the presence of God. What he does is he takes even the idea of love your neighbor as yourself as working on oneself so that we can go forward towards the other, where the other person truly is. So we find our own humanity, then we find the humanity, realize that the other person is human too in their difference. And then we find the presence of God. Buber, on the other hand, uses the opposite language, but in a sense comes to exactly the same place. Buber says that what we need to do when we see a human being is realize that name of God on our forehead and realize that Michal has it too. That everyone has that same name of God on their forehead too. That in that moment where I have that realization, then I can form a true connection with Michal. When I can see that we are both human beings in the image of God, we can have a time of connection, a real moment of empathy. But what Buber warns us is the moment I do that, then suddenly I start defining Michal. I start saying woman instead of man. I start saying tall instead of short. I think you're a little taller than I am. I keep saying, I put all these definitions on Michal, and for Buber, that's turning Michal into an it rather than a person. So what we have to embrace is that moment of connection without turning people into an it, without turning people into a they or a he or a she, and instead find the you. Find the you that connects with the I. And in both cases, both Buber and Levinas are asking us to find the presence of God in each person, to realize that each person is important and each person expresses the truth of being created in the image of God. And actually, what both Levinas and Buber are saying is, Levinas says, don't fear the other, embrace it. And Buber has said, don't try to define the other, but embrace it and see them for both cases who they truly are rather than whom we want to be. And when we do that, then we are standing in the presence of the high priest, seeing the name of God on each of our foreheads, and each of us are expressing the image of God in the world. Shabbat Shalom. So when you're dressing in your costumes on Purim, think about how each costume is the image of God. We'll see. And I am curious to see if anybody can guess how I'll be dressed as a golem in 2 weeks. Shabbat Shalom.